Right now, there is a very specific kind of panic that does not show up in official statements and does not get acknowledged from behind podiums with flags on either side. It is the quiet, fluorescent-lit panic of policy aides speed-walking down West Wing corridors with legal memos clutched to their chests. It is the kind of panic that hums beneath the surface when a president's favorite weapon suddenly stops working. And at this moment, that is exactly what has happened. Donald Trump's preferred instrument of leverage, the U.S. dollar backed by sweeping tariff threats, has just jammed in full public view. For more than a year, you have watched this administration treat tariffs not as a narrow economic adjustment tool, but as a blunt force geopolitical hammer. Canada was told repeatedly and loudly that it had no real choice. Accept Washington's terms. Swallow the tariffs. Align your trade policy with ours, or prepare to watch your economy suffocate under the weight of America's market power. The assumption driving that posture was simple. The United States is too big to bypass. The dollar is too dominant to ignore. The gravitational pull of the American consumer is too powerful to resist. But here is the problem with assuming gravity never shifts. Sometimes two other bodies align and create their own orbit. Just minutes ago, Brazil and Canada announced a $270 billion critical resources pact that does something Washington insisted was impractical, unrealistic, and economically suicidal. It bypasses the United States dollar entirely. It establishes a bilateral clearing mechanism designed specifically to route around the American banking system. No correspondent banks in New York, no automatic dollar settlement, no convenient choke point for the U.S. Treasury to squeeze when politics turn sour. If you are sitting at home thinking this sounds abstract, technical, far removed from your day-to-day life, stay with me. Because what happened in Brasilia is not just another ceremonial signing. It is a structural shift. It is a declaration, in the language of finance rather than diplomacy, that the United States can be worked around. Let's rewind the tape 24 hours. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down Trump's emergency tariffs on Canada and Mexico. It was a rare institutional rebuke, a clear legal signal that executive overreach has limits. A normal administration might have used that moment to recalibrate, to de-escalate, to quietly reopen channels and reduce the temperature. Instead, within hours, the president signed a new executive order imposing a blanket 10% global tariff and floated even harsher measures under national security authorities. That decision was meant to project dominance. It was meant to show that no court ruling, no ally, no market fluctuation could restrain the White House. But while the administration was busy proving it could still swing the hammer, Mark Carney was doing something far more dangerous to American leverage. He was building an alternative toolkit. And to understand why that matters, you have to understand who Mark Carney is. This is not a provincial figure improvising on the world stage. He is a former governor of the Bank of Canada, a former governor of the Bank of England, a man who spent years inside the machinery of global capital flows. He knows where the pipes run beneath the floorboards of the financial system. He understands that power in the 21st century is less about who shouts the loudest and more about who controls settlement mechanisms. When Carney appeared alongside Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to announce the $270 billion pact, the headline figure was designed to command attention. But the number, enormous as it is, was not the real shock. The real shock was the architecture beneath it. Energy cooperation, agricultural integration, critical mineral pooling, and most importantly, a direct bilateral clearinghouse structured to settle trade in local currencies, supported by digital ledgers and commodity-backed swap lines. That phrase, local currencies, is what rattled markets. Because for nearly 8 decades, the U.S. dollar has functioned as the oxygen of global trade. Even when two countries have no direct economic dispute with the United States, their transactions are often denominated in dollars and cleared through American institutions. That arrangement gives Washington extraordinary leverage. It is why sanctions work. It is why tariff threats feel credible. It is why presidents believe they can dictate terms far beyond their borders. When two major economies say, calmly and publicly, that they are constructing a highway that does not run through New York, it sends a signal, not just to Washington, to everyone. Watch the market reaction and you see that signal translated into numbers. The dollar index dipped sharply. Treasury yields climbed as foreign holders reassessed risk. Analysts issued hurried notes about reserve diversification. This was not ideological commentary. It was capital recalculating exposure. And here is the deeper layer. Brazil did not enter this arrangement casually. Lula's government has been openly frustrated by tariff pressure and by what it perceives as erratic American foreign policy. Canada, for its part, has spent months absorbing escalating threats from Washington. Both countries reached a similar conclusion. Reliance on a single dominant clearing system makes you vulnerable when that system is controlled by a volatile political actor. So they diversified. The Pact integrates Canadian and Brazilian supply chains for critical minerals, lithium, nickel, copper, rare earth elements, niobium. These are not optional commodities. They are foundational inputs for electric vehicles, grid infrastructure, advanced defense systems, consumer electronics. The United States is aggressively trying to secure these materials to compete with China and rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity. Until now, it operated under the assumption that friendly neighbors would remain aligned. But if Canadian aluminum and copper can flow south to Brazil or east to Europe with fewer political risks attached, then Washington's leverage shrinks. Tariffs lose their sting when your trading partner has viable alternatives. Economic coercion depends on the absence of escape routes. Carney just opened one. Now let's address the obvious counterargument. The U.S. economy is massive. It dwarfs Canada's. It outweighs Brazil's. Surely this is symbolic more than substantive. That is the comfortable narrative. But economic dominance is not simply about size. It is about trust and predictability. The exorbitant privilege economists describe America's ability to borrow cheaply and run persistent deficits rests on global confidence in the dollar's centrality. If more countries begin settling trade outside the dollar system, even incrementally, demand for dollar reserves softens. Over time, that affects borrowing costs. Higher yields mean more expensive federal debt service, which means tighter budgets or more aggressive monetary expansion, which feeds inflation. And inflation is not abstract. It shows up in mortgage rates, auto loans, grocery bills. When the president threatens 100% tariffs on any nation that experiments with alternative settlement mechanisms, he is effectively daring the world to test that threat. Canada and Brazil just called the bluff. Look also at Europe's response, or rather, its silence. In previous eras, a move perceived as undermining dollar dominance might have triggered immediate public defense from NATO partners. Instead, European finance ministries are reportedly studying the clearing framework. They are not condemning it. They are examining it. That is the sound of strategic hedging. This is what happens when economic policy is conducted through perpetual confrontation. Allies begin to insure themselves against you. The contrast in leadership styles is stark. Trump escalates through spectacle and public ultimatum. Carney operates through quiet coalition building. While the White House cycles through advisors and legal battles, Ottawa has been laying technical groundwork in multilateral forums, aligning regulatory standards, mapping supply chain redundancies. One leader treats trade as theater. The other treats it as systems engineering. And systems engineering is harder to counter with a tweet. The human cost of this shift will not be confined to trading floors. If the dollar's dominance erodes at the margins, borrowing costs can remain elevated. Credit conditions tighten. Manufacturers facing higher input costs pass them on to consumers or scale back production. Jobs tied to export markets become less secure. The promise that tariffs would create a fortress economy begins to ring hollow when factories struggle to secure affordable raw material. There was a telling moment during the signing ceremony. A reporter asked whether the pact was intended as a provocation. Carney responded that it was about mathematics. That answer matters. Because mathematics does not respond to rhetoric. It responds to incentives and constraints. If the cost of relying on a single clearing system rises, rational actors seek alternatives. Now consider the possible trajectories. The administration could escalate, attempting sanctions against the new clearing mechanism. That would deepen fragmentation and likely accelerate diversification away from the dollar. It could attempt reconciliation, quietly walking back threats in exchange for restored alignment. Or it could continue projecting strength while capital quietly reorganizes around it. None of these paths restores the previous baseline of unquestioned centrality. Once countries learn how to route around you, they do not unlearn it. We are witnessing something subtle but profound. The normalization of financial pluralism in the Western Hemisphere. A recognition that economic sovereignty requires redundancy. That reliance on a single dominant node carries political risk. The $270 billion figure is large enough to command headlines. But the architecture behind it, the clearinghouse, the swap lines, the local currency settlement is the real story. For decades, the United States assumed that even dissatisfied allies would ultimately calculate that staying within the dollar system was safer than venturing out. Today's announcement suggests that calculation is shifting. Not overnight, not catastrophically, but measurably. And here is the paradox. The more aggressively Washington threatens to punish diversification, the more rational diversification becomes. So as you watch the headlines scroll and markets fluctuate, understand that this is not merely about one president and two prime ministers. It is about the evolving topology of global finance, about whether dominance secured in the 20th century can be maintained through confrontation in the 21st. Donald Trump wanted to demonstrate that America could dictate terms unilaterally. Mark Carney demonstrated that alliances can be redesigned. The immediate consequences will unfold in bond markets, currency swaps, and supply chain contracts. The longer-term consequences will unfold in boardrooms and central banks as policymakers ask a quiet question. If Canada can build an alternative clearing mechanism with Brazil, why can't we? History rarely pivots on a single document signing. But sometimes a signature marks the moment when contingency becomes precedent. Today may be one of those moments. And the panic echoing through Washington is not about the size of the deal. It is about the realization that the toll booth is no longer the only road. And here is where the story turns from spectacle to consequence. Because what happened next was not loud. It was not theatrical. There were no dramatic rallies, no grand declarations, no immediate press conferences filled with grievance and defiance. What followed instead was something far more consequential in the long arc of American power. Institutional recalibration. The machinery of government, once bent and pressured and tested in ways many believed were unprecedented, began to quietly reset itself. The ruling did not simply shut down one legal argument. It shut down a theory that had been circulating in conservative legal circles for years, a theory that suggested the presidency was not just powerful, but insulated, that the office itself created a kind of legal force field around the person occupying it, that acts taken while in office could not be meaningfully scrutinized once that office was vacated. That theory, now, is gone. What that means in practice is both technical and seismic. Prosecutors, who had paused certain investigative pathways while awaiting judicial clarity, are no longer waiting. The ambiguity is over. Grand juries that had been operating under constrained assumptions are now operating under new instructions. Subpoenas that might have been challenged under claims of categorical immunity now move forward under ordinary legal standards. The phrase, "no person is above the law," which so often sounds rhetorical, now carries fresh operational meaning. And inside the political world, the ripple effects are already visible. Because once a former president is treated like any other citizen under criminal law, the calculus changes for everyone else orbiting that figure. Advisors, lawyers, campaign operatives, donors. The buffer of presumed untouchability dissolves. Cooperation becomes a more rational choice than defiance. Silence becomes riskier than testimony. The legal gravity shifts. For the political party that aligned itself so tightly with the former president, this creates a strategic fracture. Do they continue to frame every legal development as persecution? Or do they begin the slow process of disentanglement? We are already seeing subtle signals, carefully worded statements, emphasis on due process rather than outright denunciations of the courts, language that suggests acceptance of institutional authority rather than outright rebellion against it. And then there is the international dimension. Allies who watch the legal saga with quiet alarm are recalibrating their own assessments of American democratic resilience. For years, diplomats privately asked whether the guardrails would hold, whether courts would remain independent under sustained pressure, whether legal accountability would function when tested at the highest levels of power. The answer, at least in this instance, appears to be yes. And that answer reverberates beyond domestic politics. But accountability is not instantaneous. The ruling does not equal conviction. It does not predetermine outcomes in any specific case. It simply restores process. And process, in a democracy, is everything. Evidence must still be presented. Defenses must still be mounted. Juries must still deliberate. Appeals may still follow. The system moves deliberately, sometimes frustratingly so, but its legitimacy depends on that deliberation. There is another layer to this story that is less discussed, but deeply significant. The precedent now applies forward as much as backward. Future presidents, regardless of party, now operate under clarified constraints. The office is powerful. Yes, it commands the military. It shapes foreign policy. It steers regulatory agencies. But it does not erase criminal liability. That clarity reshapes incentives inside the Oval Office for generations to come. Consider what that means in moments of crisis. When advisors propose aggressive legal interpretations, when executive authority is stretched to its outer edge, there will now be a judicial reminder hovering in the background. Temporary power does not confer permanent immunity. Decisions made under the banner of executive authority can still be scrutinized once that authority ends. That awareness changes behavior. For the former president at the center of this legal storm, the road ahead is narrower. Appeals may continue. Public messaging will undoubtedly intensify. Fundraising emails will likely frame the ruling as partisan aggression. But the institutional door that might have shielded him entirely is closed. What remains is the same terrain any defendant faces: legal strategy, evidentiary challenges, and the unpredictable human factor of juries. And for the country, there is a broader reckoning underway. The past decade has tested assumptions about democratic durability. It has revealed vulnerabilities in norms once thought unbreakable. It has exposed how quickly rhetoric can erode trust in institutions. But it has also demonstrated something else: that institutions, when staffed by individuals committed to their roles, can withstand extraordinary pressure. Judges appointed by presidents of both parties joined in a unanimous conclusion. That unanimity matters. It strips away the easy narrative of partisan division. It signals that certain principles transcend ideological alignment. When the highest court speaks with one voice on the limits of presidential immunity, it becomes harder to dismiss the outcome as factional warfare. The political temperature will not cool overnight. Cable news panels will continue to debate motives and implications. Campaign ads will continue to spin the narrative in opposing directions. Social media will amplify outrage and celebration in equal measure. But beneath that noise, the quieter reality persists. A constitutional line has been drawn, clearly and firmly. There is a tendency in American political culture to view each legal milestone as either apocalypse or vindication. But this moment is something subtler. It is not the collapse of an individual's political movement, nor is it the final chapter of any legal saga. It is, instead, a reaffirmation of structure, a reminder that power is bounded, that offices are temporary, that accountability, though delayed, is not optional. History will likely view this episode less through the lens of personality and more through the lens of precedent. Scholars will analyze the opinion's language. Law schools will teach its reasoning. Future litigants will cite it, and future presidents will read it. The decision becomes part of the constitutional architecture, embedded in the ongoing dialogue between branches of government. And perhaps most importantly, citizens will absorb it. Not all at once, not uniformly, but gradually. The idea that even the most powerful official can face ordinary legal standards reinforces a civic expectation. It strengthens the notion that democracy is not self-executing. It depends on enforcement, on courts willing to rule, on prosecutors willing to pursue evidence, on juries willing to deliberate honestly. The closing image here is not one of triumph or defeat. It is procedural. Courtrooms with fluorescent lighting, legal briefs stacked in orderly piles, attorneys preparing arguments, judges issuing written opinions. The slow, methodical work of law. It lacks spectacle. It lacks the adrenaline of rallies or breaking news banners. But it is, in its own way, far more consequential. Because in the end, the endurance of democratic systems is measured not by moments of calm, but by moments of strain. And in this moment of strain, the system responded not with collapse, but with clarity. The presidency remains powerful, but it is not untouchable. Former presidents remain influential, but they are not immune. The rule of law, tested and challenged, remains intact. And that is what happens now. Not fireworks, not finality, but process. Accountability proceeding, step by deliberate step. Institutions reaffirming their boundaries. A country continuing its complicated experiment in self-government, reminded once again that authority in America is vast, but it is not absolute.